I think Brad's done.
Yeah.
Go home, let's say he's got it.
I'm good. I'm Brett. You from USU? I am.
Yeah, actually, Drew and I work at UDWR-USU. Are you a grad student over there or something?
No, personally not. I actually teach the
Oh, cool.
and so
You're just down here giving them
yeah, and we're on spring break, so did this and then we're headed down.
Did you come here on spring break?
I didn't really check the schedule.
You drew the short end of the stick, huh?
Were you
It's
guys
like
going?
you just ruined 2 days of my spring break.
Cool.
Yeah, it's pretty good. We're excited for some warmer weather.
Yeah.
Everybody here from the DNR.
UDWR, yeah.
UDWR.
A couple probably from wildlife resources, a few from upstairs. It was a retiree. A couple from DNR.
48 hours.
It's our parent agency
We live
upstairs.
Yeah.
Go to school there, right?
Yep.
What are you studying?
I'm studying physics.
Wow.
Yes.
What? That stuff is so
We'd
simple.
like to welcome everyone to the seminar today and thank you for coming out. The state law now requires that we keep a tally of everyone that state funds feed. So if you could make sure you sign this before you leave, that would be great. So we'd like to thank Chase for coming down and talking about how drought impacts recreational angling in the Mountain West. I'll let him go ahead and introduce himself and his professional expertise and turn the time over.
Thank you so much, Shauna. And thank you for the opportunity to come down and chat with all you folks today. So, yeah, my name is Chase Lamborn, and I got my bachelor's degree in recreation resource management. And then after I finished that, I went into work for the Forest Service a little while, and then decided that I probably was a little ill-prepared for that. So I went back for a master's degree. And before that, I was studying national monument designations in southeastern Utah. And after that, I went back to work for the Forest Service for a little bit, and then saw an opportunity to come back to Utah State University, and then got a job as a research associate there, which I've been doing for the last probably 4 years. And we've worked on projects like the Mountain Accord project and the American Fork Visioning project. We did all the data collection for those. And then did something that I said I would never ever do, and that's start a PhD. So just trucking along there. So. But yeah, anyway, so I'm in the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism at Utah State University, which is within the Department of Environment and Society in the College of Natural Resources. And as Shauna said, I'm here to talk to you today about how drought affects recreational angling in the Intermountain West. So to start out, there are kind of two basic topics that I want to go over today. One of them is just a really brief introduction of how drought affects freshwater ecosystems. And then the second part of this is how drought affects angling and recreational fisheries. So when the first part, how drought affects freshwater ecosystems. So when I say drought conditions, what I'm specifically talking about is lower than average flows and warmer than normal temperatures for streams and rivers. Most of I'm going to focus specifically on rivers and streams. So yeah, warmer than normal, or lower than normal flows and warmer than average temperatures. And so this is just a really basic distribution of cold water habitat within the lower 48. And obviously much of the Intermountain West is dominated by cold water habitat. Obviously we have a large diversity of fishes in the Intermountain West, but I'm going to specifically focus on just cold water species. So what has been happening in the West over the last 30 years? So Daniel Isaac, he's a Forest Service researcher, fisherman fisheries biologist, and he and his colleagues published a paper in 2012. And what they found is that over the last 30 years in the West, they've seen a shift in the runoff cycle, and they've also seen an increase in average water temperatures. And the two main drivers that they found for these shifts are warmer air temperatures and decreased water volume. But warmer air temperatures was the dominant factor that they found for these two changes. So just to briefly describe what those are. So our runoff cycle is changing. It's starting earlier in the spring. It's shifting earlier. And then, which means that we have lower flows during the summer on average than we used to. And with temperatures, with that runoff cycle shifting earlier into the spring, we're actually having colder than normal spring runoff temperatures, but warmer summer, fall, and winter temperatures throughout the rest of the year. And how much warmer? So in this paper, they said that they've seen, on average in the West, about a 0.22 degrees Celsius increase per decade of water temperatures. And so from 1980 to about now, that means that average summer water temperatures for streams and rivers have increased about 0.8 degrees Celsius from what they found. So just to kind of give you a visual representation of what that looks like, it's just the runoff cycle is shifting back earlier into the spring. And for what that means for the summer, so if we take this hydrograph from the Yellowstone River in year 2000, I didn't pick this for any particular reason, I just graphed one. And we look at the hottest point of the year, which is kind of right around August 1st, and we draw a line through this decrease of flow throughout the rest of this, referred to the summer, and we kick that back 2 weeks. And draw a line through here, and we can see that there's about 1,000 CFS difference from what it would have been just by shifting the runoff cycle back a little 2 weeks. So this is the hottest time of the year. And so temperature and runoff have an inverse relationship, which probably most of you know. So this is, again, flow from, or 5 years of flow on the Yellowstone River from 2012 to 2016. And 2014 was a really, really big runoff year. And in 2015 and 2016 were much smaller. But as you can see, on this 2014 year, where the runoff was quite large, they barely broke 20 degrees Celsius on their temperatures. But in 2015 and 2016, they climbed well above 20 degrees Celsius. So if you look at just 1 year, this is 2016, and this is a year that the Yellowstone River experienced a pretty extreme drought event. They had record-breaking low flows and really, really warm water temperatures. And if we draw a line here across 20 degrees Celsius, which on average is about the point where cold water fish species start to become stressed. And obviously there's some variation in that given the species, but we'll just say on average about 20 degrees Celsius. And we draw a line here on August 1st, which is the hottest portion of this year. It's this little tiny piece right here that can cause some pretty serious consequences for cold water fish species. So the longer we spend within that range and the higher the temperatures get, the bigger the impacts, or the higher potential there is for impacts on cold water fish species. So what are these impacts that I'm talking about? So ultimately it's just stress on cold water fish species. As the water gets warmer, there's lower dissolved oxygen, so it's with water temperature and dissolved oxygen, there's an inverse relationship. As water temperature increases, dissolved oxygen decreases. And so cold water fish species have to work harder to get the oxygen they need, so they'll move into faster water, expend more energy, and ultimately just become more exhausted the longer they have to be in those types of conditions. And in addition to that, there can be greater concentrations of parasites and diseases, and also with them being more exhausted, they're more susceptible to being infected by these things. And then they're also competing with other species, such as smallmouth bass and things like that, and then can be more susceptible to predation as well. So this is just one quick example of one of these low warm flow events that happened in the Columbia River Basin in 2015. And there's a couple pictures a picture of some sockeye that were affected by this event. So in 2015, the Columbia River reached into the mid-70s as far as temperature. And this low and warm flow event killed 250,000, which was half of their entire sockeye return that summer. These fish were coming in right as these temperatures were reaching the maximum points, and it was pretty hard on them. This is a picture of some of the fish they were pulling out of the fish ladder on Bonneville Dam. And Russ Kiefer from the Idaho Fish and Game in an interview said that they lost about 90% of the Snake River's sockeye before they ever got to ice-covered dam from this low and warm flow event. And here are just some pictures of kind of the diseases that these sockeye were inflicted with and causing their mortality as they were trying to make their way up the Columbia River to their spawning grounds. And just to give you an idea of how big of an impact this was, so just specifically on the Snake River, Since the year 1991, they've spent about $40 million in restoration efforts for sockeye. And in the year 2012, they had 243 returning fish. And so 2015 was the year that they were expecting one of the biggest returns they've had in a long time. They were expecting over 1,400 fish to make it. And with this low, or with the conditions in the lower Columbia River, they had about 1% actually make it. So it's a really big impact on sockeye that they've been working really hard to restore. So that's just a really brief overview of how drought affect cold water fish species. So then, now I want to talk about how these impact recreational fisheries. So here are a couple headlines from 2016 when the Yellowstone was in the middle of its low warm flow event. So the first one reads, Governor declares state of emergency for Yellowstone River fish kill. This is a New York Times article. It says tiny invader, deadly to fish, shuts down river in Montana. And this is a High Country News article, and it says after thousands of fish die in the Yellowstone River, officials lift boating ban. So what happened? So in 2016, as I said, there was a pretty severe drought event. And these low and warm conditions led to an outbreak of proliferative kidney disease, which has been known to be really lethal and cause up to 100% mortality in where the outbreak occurs. Luckily, they didn't have nearly that bad of an impact, but they did have about an estimated 10,000 fish, or a little over 10,000 fish, die from this outbreak. And in response to this outbreak, they closed 183 miles of the Yellowstone River to absolutely no boating, no fishing, no wading, no tubing, pretty much no human interaction at all with the river. And the full closure lasted 15 days, but after that, certain sections that were impacted more were closed longer, and they kind of left some sections, and the restrictions kind of got a little more confusing after that point. But the full closure on Yellowstone lasted 15 days of this 183 miles. So our question was, what exactly happens to a recreational fishery that experiences one of these types of events? And so to do that, we kind of approached it with this systems thinking mindset. And systems thinking, the definition of systems thinking is it's a discipline that attempts to understand a system by examining the linkages and interactions between the components that comprise the entirety of that defined system. So we chose to use this model developed by Kennedy quite a while ago, back in '85, and he developed this model to kind of understand how people relate to forests that are being used for timber recreation and things like that. So we adapted this framework to kind of try to understand how these drought events affect recreational fisheries. And the four parts of this are the natural environment, the political legal system, the economic system, and the social cultural system. So what we did is we conducted, to collect data, is we conducted semi-structured interviews, and we specifically focused on outfitters and guides and fisheries biologists. We were interested in finding people who had a great deal of experience, day-to-day experience on the Yellowstone River, and also people who had a good scientific background who were more familiar with what was going on with the fish populations and could actually quantify the impacts of this drought event. And we conducted these interviews in the fall of 2017. So the drought event occurred during the summer of 2016, and then went through the winter and the whole next summer, and we started conducting interviews in 2017, kind of to see how things had changed throughout that next year. So the interview structure, like I said, we kind of used this systems thinking framework, and then we formulated questions within each one of those four spheres, and we looked at the literature to kind of find what we could see there on how drought has impacted recreational fisheries. And then we also asked a lot of exploratory questions to try to get at some things that we wondered but couldn't find in the literature. And so the questions that we answered, and since these were semi-structured, like pretty open-ended interviews, we would ask kind of broad questions like, have you seen changes in fish composition, or how has this closure affected your business, or things like that. And then we would go on from there and discuss these things in a lot more detail. At this point, we've conducted 8 interviews, which I know sounds extremely underwhelming, but we did talk to a lot of folks, and we were pretty specific with the criteria of the people we were looking for. We were looking for the most experienced people on the Yellowstone River, and so we talked to most of the people, or a lot of shop owners, and people who have worked there for a long period of time, and we called folks, and they would always kind of direct us to these key people, and we got most of these key people and interviewed them. And just to give you an idea how experienced these people are, so the interviews lasted between 44 and 90 minutes, so an average interview was just over an hour. And the number of years of experience ranged from 7 to 57, but most of the folks we talked to had, about 20 years of experience. So a lot of time they've spent on the water there. And we're still in the process of a couple of key contacts that I'm working on interviewing right now, and hoping to get those done here pretty soon and wrap this up, the data collection piece of this. So with the analysis, all of these interviews were recorded and transcribed, and the way we go about figuring out or analyzing these transcriptions is we just read through them a bunch of times and looking for these major themes. And then once we have kind of these major themes identified, we group them all together and then read them through again, and then even break them down farther than that to try to tease out all of the pieces of information that we're getting from these people. And so we're looking, like I said, we're looking for themes. So we're looking for things that almost everybody has mentioned as being, so kind of the dominant themes within these conversations. We also use a software called In Vivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software that really helps us through this process. So this is kind of the model that we've developed at this point. And so it has the Yellowstone River in the middle with those 4 pieces, the 4 pieces that I mentioned earlier in the systems thinking approach. And then we've identified themes and then tied them to each one of these components. So what I want to do now is just briefly touch on each one of these, and not go through every single theme that we picked up through the study, but just kind of touch on a couple of them to give you an idea of what kind of data we're collecting and what, the impacts that drought has had on the Yellowstone River watershed. So the first one is fish. So what we found out is that the PKD outbreak, after everything was said and done, really only affected whitefish, mountain whitefish. Very, very few trout actually died from this. So, people were saying it was less than like 0.1%, what I was told. So very, very few trout. But the next year during the surveys and things like that, people, and then the outfitters and guides who were out on the water did actually notice that there was a pretty large reduction in larger brown trout. And one of the fisheries biologists I talked to said to be careful not to tie that specifically to the PKD outbreak. He said the brown trout essentially had this kind of 1, 2, 3 punch. They went through an extremely hard summer with the PKD outbreak, with the drought events. Then they went directly into their spawning cycle, and then they had an extremely hard and cold winter. And then through that, they went and did their surveys the next spring, and then they found that there was either a 10 to 50% reduction in brown trout that were over 13 inches or something like that. But so on the upside, they do have a really young, or a really strong younger cohort that they expect to kind of fill in those gaps pretty quickly. And rainbow cutthroat hybridization is also something that was brought up quite a bit, and some of the folks we talked to attributed some of this hybridization into the way the water runoff cycle has shifted and condensed, and their spawning cycles they were saying their spawning cycles are starting to overlap more, so the probability of hybridization is becoming higher. So that's something that they're trying to address as well. And then they don't know the exact amount of impact that the drought has had on the cutthroat, but they were pretty concerned because a lot of the spawning tributaries got really, really low and warm or actually dried up, so they were concerned that those juvenile fish never actually made it through that summer with as hot as it was. And the last one is smallmouth bass. So every single year, smallmouth bass are moving farther and farther up into the Yellowstone system. It's not a huge concern for a lot of folks at this point because they are in such low numbers, but they do see them every single year move up farther. And in Montana at this point, they're still treating them as game fish. And so it's not like or Flaming Gorge Dam or something like that where, you know, it's a mandatory killer. They're still treated as game fish, and they're not trying to actually like kind of push them back from these as they're moving out. So, and then the next one is flow and temperature. So there has been on the Yellowstone River a 2-week shift in the runoff cycle. And this was, or the outfitters and guides, they couldn't say that they had seen any changes in the runoff cycle. They just said, oh yeah, it's cyclical. Some years are big, some years are small. But when we talked to the fisheries biologists, they said, yeah, when they're looking at the data, they've definitely seen some changes in the way their runoff cycle happens. And then hoot owl regulations. So these are closures from about 2 o'clock in the afternoon to midnight. And these are put in place when the river reaches a certain temperature, which is 73 degrees over 3 consecutive days. Then they'll go into these hoot owl regulations, and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you can no longer fish on the river. And at this point, they get into hoot owl regulations on average about every other year during the peak of the summer, when they reach the 73 degrees. So, and then the next piece that I want to share with you is this rules, regulations, and law piece. And so, as I said, the hoot owl closures, if the river reaches 73 degrees for 3 consecutive days, this is a way that the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has kind of tried to protect these fish during one of their most stressed times during the hottest part of the summer. And as I said, they're about every other year. The closure was an emergency situation, and just because of the PKD operating the really extreme events that they were in. And that has some pretty large effects when we start talking about economic impacts and things like that to the Yellowstone River Watershed, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And then another thing that I wanted to bring up here is not necessarily related to drought, but aquatic invasive species. So a lot of folks expressed concern to me about this law that was passed in Montana, which is for the aquatic invasive species prevention pass. And for for residents, it's a $2 annual fee, and for non-residents, it's $15, and you have to pay that one time a year. And one of the outfitters told me that as people come into their shop, say it's a grandfather and a grandson, and they want to go fishing for one day, and on top of their license and their conservation, so their fishing license, their conservation license, and their $15 invasive species pass, a 1 day, or the somewhat 2 day, but to go fish for 1 day in Montana for one person is $50 right now. And so with that, plus the guide trip and the tip and everything like that, people are, for 1 day of fishing, are spending about $700 in Montana. And so the outfitters and guides who are running shops are concerned that this $50 for 1 day of fishing might be deterring people from coming in. And, so that's just something they're concerned about, since you guys are all Fish and Wildlife Resources folks. I thought it could be something I want to share with you. So economy, this part was really interesting to me because the closure really did have a pretty significant impact on the Yellowstone River watershed. But I first want to go over specifically hoot owl regulations. So hoot owl, outfitters and guides have really been able to work around hoot owl regulations pretty easily, and they're set up in a way that they're really conducive to the trips that they run. And I just want to share a quote with you from one of the outfitters who I talked to. And he said, when I asked him about how the hoot owl regulations are on his operation, he said, hoot owls aren't terrible because people are still out here. Everyone just quits early, but they're still at the hotels and everything like that. They're still going out to dinners. And they're still going out to dinner. Hoot owls probably hurt us a little bit because people hear that there is a hoot owl, and maybe they say, let's not go to Montana this next week. But usually people plan months ahead of time, and they're going anyway. When the entire river is closed like last year, some of the best restaurants in town were dead. All of the hotels were dead. That was just different. And so yeah, the full closure that hit the watershed had a really significant impact on these people and their businesses. And so the Institute of Tourism and Recreation Research at the University of Montana, which is kind of a sister institution to us at Utah State, they estimated that the closure affected just Park County, one of the counties on the Yellowstone River. They lost $360 to $524,000 from that 15-day closure in potential revenue. And one rafting company claimed that they lost almost $100,000 in potential revenue from the closure because they had no alternatives. They couldn't run trips, and so they had to shut down early that year. Outfitters and guides, the ones that had alternatives fared a little better. They maybe lost, $8,000 to $10,000 of revenue that month. The ones who did not have alternatives fared far worse. And what do I mean by alternatives is places to fish other than the Yellowstone River. So if they were kind of towards the end of the closure, they could travel, or if they were closer to other rivers like the Missouri or the Bighorn, they could travel outside and guide trips elsewhere. But people who were kind of in the middle of the closure and didn't really have quick access to other places had a really hard time. And I also asked folks if guiding trips for smallmouth bass or things like that would be a feasible option to help when things like this are occurring. And almost every single one of them said they're just not attractive. They said they could probably sell that to some other guys who they've worked with every single year, and they're coming for like a 4-day guide trip, and they might be able to sell like one day going down below Billings and fishing for smallmouth bass. But all of them said essentially that people are coming to Montana to fish for trout, and it's really hard to sell them on anything else. And so the last piece of this is kind of the social or the experience of fishing the Yellowstone River. And again, this is not necessarily related to drought, but one of the major things that every single person I've talked to, they said that the use on the Yellowstone River is increasing exponentially, especially over the last 5 or so years. So parking lots that usually on 4th of July weekend maybe have 50 cars in them now have over 100. And he said constantly as you're floating down, you're just moving around people, and there's big groups of people, and you can't get away from it. And the people who've been there for a long time are concerned about not necessarily the impacts of the fishing, but just the experience of floating and fishing the Yellowstone, solitude, and things like that. And this use has been increasing from anglers to non-anglers, a lot of paddle boarders, tubers, and things like that. Another shift that these folks have been seeing is that there has been far more people fishing the shoulder season. So this is the early spring and late fall. And I'm not sure if this is specifically due to more favorable weather during those times of years, or if it's just the demand is so much higher that people are just trying to get out when there aren't as many people on the river. But these outfitters and guys are saying as soon as that it's feasible to get a boat on the water, there are already people out there fishing, which really wasn't the case not that long ago. And then another part that has to do with the experience of fishing the river is that every single person I talked to said that the fishing is getting far more difficult on the Yellowstone River. And they attributed these to 2 different things. And the first one is fishing pressure. Said that the pressure is getting much higher with the increased use. And then also these drought conditions when they're in UDWR or the UDWR regulations are in place, or just when things are getting warm and the water's getting really low, the fishing is getting really, really difficult. And that's been a big change that they've seen over their 20 years of experience of being on Yellowstone. So anyway, yeah, this is the framework that we're working with right now and trying to organize all of these things that we're hearing from these people. And so just in conclusion, we did find that the drought has affected all 4 of these systems that we've used to define the Yellowstone River Watershed. The 2 biggest impacts are probably ecological impacts from the drought, which was the whitefish mortality. And then the other one is the economic, the loss of business. And some folks that I've talked to, even the next year, they're still trying to recover from the loss of business that they had. And the change in paradigm that people have, he said, because the next year was actually a really big water year, 2017. But people had in their mind that August was a really bad time to come to the Yellowstone. So even though the water was perfect and the fishing was really good during August, he said it just died because people had in their mind that August is bad. So it just kind of has these impacts that kind of last a little while that these outfitters and guys are trying to work around. So the next steps in this research, I want to look through the literature a little bit more and try to find some more supporting information for these themes to just kind of make sure that things that we're getting from, the information we're getting from these folks is as accurate as possible, and just try to find some more supporting information to kind of bolster what they're saying. And then complete all the models, so we're just working on kind of finding all the interactions between all these pieces. And then one of our master's students right now is starting this similar process, but he's looking at places within Utah. And ultimately, he's looking for places that may be vulnerable to these types of drought events. And so we're collecting data from some state folks and fish data and things like that. Moving from there. So anyway, that's all of the information that I wanted to share with you folks today. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to address them. Yeah.
Was those closures on the Yellowstone in 2015, were they due to public outcry, or were they did the Department of Fish and Wildlife up there, Fish and Game, think that they could reduce the disease presence by closing?
It was kind of FWP. They were really concerned. They didn't really know what they were dealing with because they weren't sure if this PKD, if people were going to spread it throughout, spread it throughout the region. And then they were trying to reduce the impacts to the
So was it
fisheries
driven
as well.
by the anglers in, or the
FWP, from what I
Okay.
understand.
And the second question was, did they measure the presence of PKD before, during, and after their implementation of those closures?
They, from what I understand, is they didn't even know they had PKD in the system before. But now, from what I've been told, is they think that it's been there all along, but they just never had paid attention to it or noticed it, and then this thing happened that made them pay attention to it. And so, but yeah, and even last year, 2017, with the really good water conditions, the big runoff, they still saw some fish mortality. They just thought we're picking up dead fish, and they were infected with PKD as well, but the impacts were negligible.
Chase, what percentage of angling on the Yellowstone is made up of non-guided participation?
I'm not sure the exact percent. I know it's a lot of folks.
Do you think you're missing something by not asking those folks what their impacts were?
Yeah, definitely.
We're just thinking about the Utah study and maybe working with you guys to make it a little bit more robust.
No, absolutely. And that is something that we've talked about, is over this next summer doing kind of almost like a survey. Or I'm doing a survey up there, putting takeouts and talking to anglers about it. But we're just really not sure where we're going to go at this point with it, but it's something we discussed. Any other questions?
So I have a question. So from your research, it's more beneficial to have the hoot owl like a shorter fishing time per day than it is to completely close it.
Yeah, I mean the businesses and everything else. It's when the PKD outbreak occurred, it was really scary for folks. All the outfitters and guys I talked to, in hindsight, they may wish that it wasn't a full closure for as long as it was. But since nobody really knew what was going on, they don't regret, or they're not really critical of the way things were handled, because it was really scary for them too to see this big outbreak happen, and they didn't know what the impacts were going to be. But I think in the future, I don't know how better to handle something like that, but they definitely, the hoot owl regulations, they can work around, they're totally fine with that. Then they really do, they care about the resource a lot. They have a lot of concern for the quality of it and the health of it, so they really support FWP, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the regulations that they put in place there.
Chase, I have a question for Drew or Craig, maybe, if that's all right. I don't really see the purpose of the hoot owl closures or the 15-day closure, would that really impact, or maybe you could answer it? Did it really make any difference to survival of fish?
That was the question I asked him. I didn't really get an answer. You know,
Oh.
whether they, you know, they had monitoring going on throughout this.
Okay,
And,
that's-
you know, what was the effectiveness of these regulation changes?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know.
You know, did it reduce the disease load? Did they see less mortality at the same flows and kind of same runoff regime? I guess that was my second question.
Yeah, with the PKD thing being a single event, I don't know. But with the HUDA, that was probably something that FWP, I would imagine, has information.
That'd
It
be
actually does
interesting to know.
reduce mortality and stress.
Yeah.
Typically, you'll have a cycle, a warming cycle through the day, and so you're not pressuring those fish during that stressful time that they're experiencing warmer temperatures. I'm sure that's why they had that in place.
I'm wondering how much the water quantity is influenced by like agricultural withdrawals, or is that not a thing that happens in Montana?
It is. It's something that folks definitely discussed, but it's not, from what I was told, it's not something that's on the table to be discussed really at all.
Right.
They do notice, I mean, outfitters and guides do notice changes in flow with withdrawals. And there was no restrictions on water withdrawals during the full river closure. It was just really the recreational use. But it's something that people think about, but it's just, they don't feel like they can really have any say in that.
Chase, as far as the closure goes, I mean, there was definitely an impact during the closure economically, but then there's got to be a lag and there's got to be a longer term impact. Do you have any idea as far as a recovery timeline for economic?
Yeah, so as I said, within that next year, in August, people did notice, it was kind of like July was pretty good, and then August, even though the conditions were actually better on the river, they did notice a dip in business until word started getting out that the Yellowstone was in good condition and fishing conditions were good, and then they kind of noticed business pick back up. They say that it's kind of this next year lag. So then we had a really good water year in 2017. People have that, this is kind of the way they describe it to me, is people have that in their mind. And so 2018, they'll fish like it was 2017, or they'll plan kind of in that.
So if we end up with situations where we have consecutive years, then the potential lag is, you know, if we had 2 consecutive years, you're looking at 2 years out, 3, not that it's going to be a direct linear relationship, but something like that.
That's kind of the way it was described to me, what they saw in their own business and sales, yeah.
Do you know what visitors are using as their information source to, I mean, if there was somebody saying, no, really, it's good, come on out, and they were cluing into that, you wouldn't have that lag.
Yeah.
But what are people?
I don't know. I mean, the outfitters who were running shops, they told me, I mean, they were using, social media, Facebook and things like that, but just trying to say like, hey, everybody, like things are really good right now, like come. They were doing everything they could to attract people at that time, so I don't know.
That lag is kind of a general effect. I mean, you heard about in the Gulf Coast after the oil spill or whatever. I mean, just other places, similar kind of thing. People get this impression that lag is reality.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
leading into the drought, was there an effort to give people realistic expectations of what they were going to experience as visitors and tourists in the upcoming season from a fishing standpoint?
So say that one more time.
So let's say you had it's precipitation-based, winter precipitation-based runoff
Yeah.
water cycle, right? So they knew, based upon snowtail information, what they were going to experience in the way of drought in the upcoming year. Did they still encourage people to come to Montana to come fishing for the greatest fishing on earth, or did they give them a more realistic expectation of what they could experience in the upcoming year?
Don't
Because
come.
the last thing you want to do is give people false expectations, have them come visit, have a miserable time, and never come again.
Unless you want to stay in business.
Well, there's, you know, come on in, have some chicken, oh, we're all out.
Yeah.
That happened to me a couple times.
I was just wondering if they actually forecasted that.
From my conversations, it was pretty. They were kind of sending these things out within a few weeks of what, I mean, like if the fishing was really good and they maybe noticed their business declining, then they would kind of try to say like, hey, come, it's really good right now, come now. But I don't think
But that was in a good year, not a bad year. They were saying, stay away, it's 40 years.
Yeah. Well, and so a lot of
It's
these.
always the course series this year.
A lot of folks, you know, they plan these trips pretty far out in advance. And so when the closure was being talked about, a lot of these outfitters and guides were really scrambling to call all of the trips that they had and then reschedule. And, you know, turning, you know, a floating trip on the Yellowstone into like a walkway trip in Yellowstone National Park, or just really trying to reorganize their structure so they don't lose that business, but they still lost quite a few trips.
How many anglers are there, outfitters are there in Utah compared to Montana?
I'm not sure.
We don't know.
Are there a lot of outfitters in Utah?
We don't have a licensing of
Okay.
fishing guides in Utah, so there's
No
so
way to
many
track
that are
them.
unknown.
Yeah, okay.
We have hunting guides, licenses.
I'm sure there's more in Montana just because they have bigger rivers.
There's one.
Are the guides and outfitters regulated along this river? In other words, do they have to compete for space out there, or
Do
are
they
they
have to
assigned
compete for
space?
permits? No. They can run as many trips as they want, whenever. So for example, if I wanted to go up there this summer, I could just get a Montana guide license and start
Yeah.
taking people on trips.
So they're starting to complain about crowding and such. It seems like the future probably holds a quota or something that if they're able and willing to get self-organized.
And honestly, a lot of the outfitters and guides were kind of in support for that if things continue the way they are. Because ultimately, I mean, you could really tell talking to them, I mean, they really cared about the resource and wanted to make sure that everything was okay with that. So they threw out a couple different ideas of what they thought may help. So it's something that's being definitely talked about at this point.
Is Montana concerned about another outbreak of PKD in the
I
river
think that
this
just-
coming summer?
I think that just depends on who you talk to. Some people say out of sight, out of mind, and they don't really think about it unless it's right in front of their face. And some of the guys I talk to who own shops kind of, they're a little more not as optimistic about the future of their business there. But, so yeah, it's a spectrum.
I was fascinated with your method of having kind of an open discussion with your survey
Mhm.
participants. And I was wondering, would you change it? Would you, now that you've done some of them, would you ask different questions or?
It's kind of a learning process as you go. So as one person brings something up, you kind of incorporate that into your future conversations. I wish I could talk to more people, but it's just not a huge group of folks who kind of fit the criteria that we're interested in. But it was a really good experience for me to kind of understand this bigger picture of how things are happening and time frames and things like that. So it was a really effective method for that aspect, to kind of understand the bigger picture stuff through that type of data. Any others?
Book your trip early or late.
Cancel one, book two, cancel one.
Book late, they're already all dead, so book early.
Book early.
Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk with you guys, and thanks for the
Thanks, Chase.
questions.
Thank you.
is all about.